affecting tomatoes. A new policy kicks in today, making way for a 21% price hike on tomato imports.
Dramatic shakeup. The Trump administration has torched a 30-year-old trade agreement that slapped a 17% tariff on fresh tomatoes from Mexico.
The U.S. government announcing a new 17% tariff on most fresh Mexican tomatoes.
When most people think of trade wars, they picture Washington and Beijing locking horns over tariffs, technology, and global dominance. But here's the surprising truth. Trade wars don't always happen with China. Sometimes they erupt with America's closest ally, Canada. For decades, Canada and the United States have shared the world's largest bilateral trade relationship. Every single day, billions of dollars worth of goods flow across their long border. Cars, oil, food, lumber, and everything in between. The two economies are so tightly linked that when one sneezes, the other usually catches a cold. But as friendly as these neighbors are, their trade history has been anything but smooth. From dairy and lumber to energy and agriculture, Canada has repeatedly drawn the line. It bans or restricts certain U.S. products to protect its own industries. And here's why it matters. When Canada slams the door on American goods, the impact isn't spread evenly across the entire United States. Instead, specific states, those that rely heavily on exports north of the border, get hit the hardest. Farmers, factory workers, and entire local economies suddenly find themselves caught in the crossfire of policies made hundreds of miles away. So what exactly has Canada banned? And why are American states scrambling to deal with the fallout? In this video, we'll break down the 6 U.S. products that Canada has recently banned or restricted. We'll look at the politics behind the decisions, the industries now on edge, and the ripple effects that are shaking up state economies. Because this isn't just about trade. It's about survival for communities that depend on Canada more than most Americans realize. Product 1: dairy, milk, and cheese. If there's one product that has fueled endless trade fights between the US and Canada, it's dairy. Canada runs what's called a supply management system for milk, cheese, and other dairy products. That means the government tightly controls how much farmers produce. It fixes domestic prices and protects local farmers with strict import limits. It keeps Canadian dairy prices high but stable, and it shields their farmers from global competition. The problem? U.S. dairy farmers, particularly in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and New York, rely on foreign markets to absorb their oversupply. American farmers produce way more milk than the domestic market can handle. Naturally, Canada looks like the perfect neighbor to sell that excess to. But when Canada slams the door shut with tariffs or bans, the result is devastating across America's dairy belt. During the USMCA negotiations, the U.S. accused Canada of unfairly blocking American dairy, while dumping other products into U.S. markets. Washington wanted more access to Canadian grocery shelves, but Ottawa held the line, defending its farmers at all costs. The result? Constant disputes, WTO complaints, and political lobbying that never seems to end. For U.S. dairy states, this isn't just about lost business. It's about survival. Milk prices collapse, farmers dump excess supply, and local communities suffer. Politically, dairy farmers have enormous influence. They're small in number, but powerful in swing states. That's why whenever Canada tightens its dairy market, you can bet American politicians are on the phone, pressuring Ottawa to open up. But Canada isn't budging. For them, dairy is sacred, and that leaves U.S. farmers facing the consequences of a trade wall just across the border. Product 2: poultry and eggs. If dairy is the most famous U.S. Canada trade battle, poultry and eggs come in a close second. Once again, Canada shields its own farmers with supply management. It ensures that domestic producers, many of them small family farms, aren't wiped out by cheaper U.S. imports. Chickens, turkeys, and eggs are kept under a tight quota system. Foreign imports face steep barriers. But what really sparks sudden bans are avian flu outbreaks in the United States. When bird flu hits poultry farms in places like Iowa, Arkansas, or Georgia, Canada often responds immediately by banning imports of chicken and eggs from affected states. It's a protective move to shield Canada's food system, but it leaves U.S. producers scrambling. For poultry farmers, these bans can be devastating. Chickens and eggs don't store well. You can't just wait for markets to reopen. Oversupply leads to price crashes, eggs being dumped, and financial stress across America's Farm Belt. And with chicken being one of America's largest agricultural exports, even short-term bans ripple through local economies. The political fallout is also significant. Governors from poultry-heavy states often pressure Washington to fight back. They argue that Canada is using health concerns as a cover for protectionism. Meanwhile, Canadian leaders insist they're simply protecting public health and domestic farmers from unfair competition. In the end, Canada's poultry bans are a one-two punch, a blow to America's farm states, and a reminder that even close allies don't always play fair when food security is at stake. Product 3. Beef and pork. Few industries symbolize American agriculture like beef and pork. Texas cattle ranches, Nebraska feedlots, and Kansas hog farms form the backbone of U.S. meat exports. But when it comes to Canada, that industry often runs into a brick wall. Historically, Canada has imposed sweeping bans on U.S. beef and pork during disease scares. Whether it was mad cow disease, BSE, in the early 2000s, or swine flu outbreaks more recently, even when the risks were contained or minimal, Canada's move to shut out U.S. meat left American farmers reeling. Meat exports can't just be stored. Animals keep growing, feed costs pile up, and prices collapse when markets close. The impact is sharpest in America's Midwestern states. Ranchers in Texas, Nebraska, and Kansas often find themselves lobbying Washington to retaliate, or at least pressure Ottawa to lift bans quickly. Industry groups argue that Canada's measures go beyond legitimate safety concerns. They serve as thinly veiled protectionism for Canada's own cattle and pork sectors. The irony is that Canada also exports beef and pork south of the border. It takes advantage of U.S. market openness. That's why American ranchers feel especially burned when Canada shuts them out at the first sign of trouble. Over time, these bans have eroded trust. They've created one of the most bitter chapters in U.S.-Canada trade relations. For Canada, the justification is always the same: protecting public health and its own meat industry. For American farmers, it feels like another case of neighbors turning their back when times get tough. At the end of the day, beef and pork bans highlight just how fragile cross-border agricultural trade can be, and how quickly politics can override decades of business ties. Product 4. Grain and wheat products. Grain may not get the same headlines as dairy or beef, but for farmers in states like North Dakota, Montana, and Kansas, wheat exports to Canada are life or death. Unfortunately, this sector has been plagued by disputes over labeling, subsidies, and pesticide residues. One recurring issue is country of origin labeling. Canadian regulators often insist that U.S. wheat be labeled in ways that make it less attractive to Canadian millers. Another flashpoint is pesticide standards. Canada sometimes bans shipments of U.S. grain if traces of chemicals not approved in Canada are detected, even if those same products are widely used in the U.S. For farmers on the northern border, these restrictions can be brutal. They face price crashes when shipments get rejected. Grain elevators fill up with unsold wheat. Since wheat is perishable over time, storage problems add financial pressure, forcing many farmers to sell at a loss. Subsidies also fuel anger. American farmers accuse Canada of giving its producers unfair advantages, while shutting out U.S. competition. The result is a bitter cycle of disputes, complaints to trade panels, and finger-pointing across the border. The states most affected are those closest to Canada. Farmers rely on cross-border trade as a natural outlet for surplus crops. When that outlet closes, rural economies take the hit. Local businesses, from equipment suppliers to trucking companies, suffer along with farmers. For Canada, it's about protecting food standards and keeping control over its agricultural sector. For U.S. farmers, it feels like another example of Canada bending the rules to its advantage. Grain may not be glamorous, but in the trade war between neighbors, it's one of the most quietly devastating battlefields. Product 5. Energy products, coal and oil derivatives. When most people think of U.S. Canada energy ties, they imagine pipelines and cooperation. After all, the two countries are each other's top energy partners. But in recent years, Canada's push for green energy has created friction, especially around imports of American coal and oil derivatives. Canada has pledged to drastically cut its carbon emissions. It's moving away from fossil fuels and toward renewables. As part of this transition, Ottawa has banned or restricted certain coal imports, even when cheaper U.S. coal could power Canadian industries. That decision hits U.S. states like West Virginia, Wyoming, and Kentucky. In those places, coal remains a cornerstone of the local economy. For coal miners and energy producers, Canada's restrictions feel like a betrayal. They argue that the U.S. provides a stable, secure supply of energy, while Canada still relies heavily on fossil fuels itself. But Canadian leaders frame it differently. They see phasing out U.S. coal as a necessary step toward meeting climate targets, not as a personal attack on American jobs. The same applies to certain oil derivatives and petroleum byproducts. As Canada tightens environmental regulations, imports from U.S. refineries sometimes get blocked. That leaves Gulf Coast and Midwestern producers scrambling for alternative buyers. This clash highlights a deeper issue: the tension between environmental goals and economic realities. Canada wants to project itself as a leader in the fight against climate change. But in doing so, it risks undermining the livelihoods of American workers, especially across the coal and oil belt. And because these states already face shrinking demand at home, losing Canada as a customer cuts even deeper. Energy, once a symbol of U.S. Canada cooperation, has become another flashpoint, proving that even shared goals like going green come with a heavy cost for both sides. Product 6. Fruits and vegetables. Not all of Canada's bans involve heavy industry. Some of the most heated disputes are over fresh produce. Canada enforces strict food safety standards. It often blocks U.S. fruits and vegetables over concerns about pesticide levels, GMOs, or contamination risks. Seasonal restrictions also come into play. During Canadian harvest periods, Ottawa limits U.S. imports. It's meant to protect Canadian farmers from cheap competition. The hardest-hit states? Florida and California. These two powerhouses dominate America's fruit and vegetable exports, from oranges and strawberries to lettuce and tomatoes. When Canada imposes bans, thousands of farms suddenly lose one of their most profitable markets just across the border. The ripple effect goes beyond growers. Migrant workers, who form the backbone of U.S. agriculture, often see reduced hours or job losses when crops can't be sold abroad. Trucking companies, distributors, and even supermarkets feel the squeeze. Canadian shoppers, meanwhile, face higher prices and fewer choices at the grocery store. Trade disputes in produce can get especially messy. That's because of how perishable fruits and vegetables are. Unlike grain or meat, you can't just store fresh strawberries for weeks. Farmers are often forced to dump crops. They lose millions of dollars in a matter of days. Canadian officials argue that these restrictions are about food safety and sustainability, not protectionism. But for U.S. farmers, it looks like another case of politics getting in the way of fair trade. Ultimately, fresh produce bans hit hardest at the human level: farm workers, small growers, and families who depend on export markets. And with agriculture already under pressure from climate change, losing access to Canada makes survival even harder. Retaliation and trade war risks. Whenever Canada slaps bans on U.S. products, the reaction is swift. American states don't sit quietly. They push Washington to strike back. That can mean filing complaints with the World Trade Organization, WTO, demanding tariff retaliation, or leveraging political pressure during high-stakes negotiations like the USMCA. We've seen this before. The softwood lumber wars stretched on for decades. They became one of the most infamous U.S. Canada trade battles. Each side accused the other of subsidies and unfair practices that led to tariffs, court cases, and retaliatory measures. Those disputes never truly ended. They simply resurface in new forms. Now with products like dairy, meat, and energy, the problem is that retaliation often catches other industries in the crossfire. For example, if the U.S. imposes tariffs on Canadian steel, American automakers, who rely on that steel, suffer just as much as Canadian producers. What starts as a targeted strike quickly snowballs into a broader trade fight. For farmers in states like Wisconsin, Texas, and Florida, the stakes couldn't be higher. Canada isn't just any trading partner. It's the largest buyer of U.S. goods. When that door closes, there aren't many quick alternatives. That's why trade wars, even between friends, are so dangerous. Both economies end up bleeding. The irony is that Washington and Ottawa often frame themselves as global allies, united against rivals like China. Yet behind the scenes, some of the fiercest fights are happening across the world's longest undefended border. And with every new ban, the risk of a full-scale trade war grows bigger. The cost of friendship. At first glance, it seems unthinkable. The United States and Canada, neighbors, allies, and cultural cousins, locked in bitter trade battles. Yet history shows that even the closest partners will fight tooth and nail, especially when national interests are on the line. The bans we've looked at, whether dairy, beef, coal, or fruit, aren't random. They're about protecting domestic industries, preserving food security, and pushing forward national priorities like climate policy. For Canada, it's about shielding its farmers, workers, and long-term sustainability. For the US, it's about keeping markets open, especially for its massive agricultural and energy sectors. Neither side is wrong, but both sides end up clashing. The real losers in these fights are not prime ministers or presidents. They're farmers in Wisconsin, poultry workers in Georgia, coal miners in West Virginia, orange growers in Florida. When Canada blocks their products, livelihoods vanish overnight. Entire local economies, built around exports, find themselves teetering. These aren't abstract statistics. They're human costs, measured in foreclosures, layoffs, and shuttered small businesses. What's striking is that these disputes reveal the fragile balance of globalization. We often think of trade as seamless and inevitable. And when it comes from a partner as important as Canada, the shockwaves spread far faster than if it were a distant rival. There's also a lesson here about interdependence. Canada may ban certain US goods, but it still depends on American markets for its own exports. Likewise, US states desperately need Canadian buyers. This push and pull is what makes the relationship so tense. Both sides need each other, but both are constantly tempted to put their own interests first. In the end, the cost of friendship is realizing that allies can sometimes hit harder than enemies. These bans are reminders that, in trade, loyalty comes second to survival. And for America's border states, that survival is always on the line. Canada's bans may sound technical, supply management here, pesticide standards there, but their impact is anything but minor. They strike at the very heart of US state economies, leaving farmers, workers, and communities scrambling to survive. From Wisconsin's dairy farms to West Virginia's coal mines, from Florida's citrus groves to Texas cattle ranches, the bans expose just how fragile America's reliance on Canada really is. One regulation in Ottawa can mean thousands of lost jobs south of the border. And while Canada frames these moves as protecting its industries and environment, the reality is that US states are left holding the bag. Looking ahead, the question is whether Washington will negotiate or escalate. Will future presidents push harder to pry open Canada's markets? Or will they risk a cycle of tariffs and retaliations that drag both economies down? What's clear is that the U.S.-Canada partnership, as strong as it looks on paper, is always just one trade fight away from unraveling. Because trade wars aren't always fought with rivals like China. Sometimes, the biggest battles happen with your best friend. And right now, it's American states, and the people who live in them, that are paying the price.